Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. So today I want to talk a little bit about the theoretical collapse of society as we know it and how automation might factor in. So let's get to it. So many people are familiar with the concept of automation in industry. It's a process in which human resources, that is human labor, jobs, are replaced by robots which do the work cheaper, which are more precise, don't take days off, and don't complain about working conditions. Now, there's a website that you can go to, and it's called Will Robots Take My Job? It was based on research which was conducted looking at how susceptible jobs are to computerization, mechanization, also known as good old automation. So the researchers looked at 702 of the most popular occupations in the world. They used a complex statistical methodology in order to determine the probability that these would be replaced by robots in the future. Now, they indicate that 47% of jobs will be replaced by robots in the future, and I want to say that this is probably a conservative estimate because this is largely based on our current understandings of where technology is going, how technology might evolve based on what we currently know. But as we come to discover more new things and new technologies are created, that's going to mean even less and less jobs. Now, some of you are probably wondering, what the heck does this have to do with emergency preparedness, preparing for grid down collapse of civilization as we know it? Well, now if we take a look at the three-sector theory of the economy. This was a theory which tried to explain the emergence of different sectors of the economy. So they basically break it down into 5 main sectors. So there's the primary sector. That means the collection of raw materials. There's the secondary sector. That's when you take those raw materials, where you take something from the farm and you convert it into something that's usable. The tertiary sector would be your services, so that would be perhaps the grocery store which dispense that food. The information sector would of course be the internet that you're on right now, researching whether or not that food is healthy. That is the quaternary sector. Now the quinary sector is the human service sector. So this would be your psychologist, your social workers, your lawyers, your accountants, etc. So if we look at the evolution of industrialized society, you start out basically at the level of the primary sector. The tasks of most homesteaders closely resemble that of the primary sector. That is, the extraction and the consumption of raw materials. Now, the activities of homesteaders are going to dip into the secondary sector, which is the manufacturing of those materials. Maybe that means making textiles from cotton, which is taken from a field, or perhaps it means turning milk into butter. It means taking some raw material that you've extracted from the land, converting that into something which is more refined and usable for a higher order function. Now, once you get into the tertiary sector, you start getting into more specialized disciplines and occupations. These could be trades workers, blacksmiths, butchers, bakers, candlestick makers. Any occupation to be found in the average town in the Wild West could be considered a tertiary sector service. They are among the most essential of services. Now, accordingly, if society or civilization were to collapse, if we were to imagine that there was an electromagnetic pulse that wiped out all of the main transistors and we were without power for months, potentially years, you can pretty much shave off the quinary sector and the quaternary sector and a significant part of the tertiary sectors of the economy. The main ones that are going to remain are the primary and the secondary sector. And those are going to be more rooted in horticulture, meaning that everybody is going to be trying to meet their own needs from the land. Now, over time, as we see an evolution of society, people will start to trade. And that's once you start seeing trade on larger and larger scales, that's when you get a more refined tertiary sector. You have the trade of not only goods, but services that people will need. People who may be deficient in skill sets in one area will trade their goods or services for the time and labor of a person with skill sets in another specialized discipline. So to tie this all together with respect to automation and robots stealing our jobs, the more and more evolved and the more technologically dependent we become on automation to perform the work of the primary, secondary, and tertiary sector, because remember, these are the sectors which are being most affected by automation and information services to a certain degree. But by and large, the human services are pretty safe when it comes to automation. If you go to this website which analyzes the likelihood that robots will take these jobs, it is the human service jobs which are the most safe. So what I'm trying to say is that the human service jobs, the ones which are going to be least needed in a crap hits the fan situation, are the only jobs which may potentially be left. So what this means then is, as we become more technologically developed, we become more and more vulnerable to the challenges which would prevent themselves in that sort of collapse scenario. The more automated society becomes and the more smart our technology becomes, we correspondingly become more dumb in those areas. For instance, the more automated the process of agriculture becomes, the extraction of raw materials from the land, the more and more our skill sets in those areas necessarily atrophies, because no longer do we need to know those things, so our brains can be freed up to pursue other higher level cognitive pursuits in the area of the human and information services. In theory, more of our creative energy then can be allocated to research and development of new technologies. Now, as many of you know, this is unfortunately not always the case. A lot of our free time is now being consumed by amusing ourselves to death with the almost infinite amount of entertainment, video games, sports, and all other manner of personal distraction which most people are devoting their energies to. For instance, the average teenager or intellectual is not spending more time necessarily thinking about how to solve the mysteries of the universe, because they now have a machine to wash their dishes, a machine to wash their clothes, a machine to transport them to and from work, and have all of the creature comforts of modern civilization at their disposal. That has not translated into people spending more time pondering the mysteries of the universe. Unfortunately, in this infantile, sensation-seeking, hedonistic society, the exact opposite is now true. And unfortunately, Moore's law, the law that says computing power doubles every 2 years, doesn't really pertain to anything but that. Yes, technology is still advancing, but arguably not as fast as it should be in light of all of the free time that this technology has permitted us to have. The evolution of our civilization is one of increasing disciplinary segregation and intensive specialization. The more and more evolved we become as a society, the more specialized our tasks get, to the point where the jack of all trades is no more. The one man of the land who could feed himself off the land, who could do all the things that homesteaders do, from blacksmithing to forestry to agriculture to self-defense. All of these tasks become offloaded to the grid because you need to be a better computer programmer. So you leave all of the responsibility for those things to these other automated jobs. So this is why the collapse would be so intense. And this is why I think a lot of homesteaders and people who are going off the grid, they perhaps cannot articulate this in the way that I'm articulating it now. It's not that they can't do it, like they don't have the vocabulary necessarily. It's just perhaps they haven't conceived it in the way I've conceived it. But they have the wisdom that the more technologically dependent we become, the more vulnerable we become to collapse. And they're talking about by the year 2030 or 2040 possibly, that 47% of the jobs that exist today will be better served by robots. Now, indeed, there's a significant part of the people who are going off grid who are Luddites. The Luddites, if you recall, in the early 1800s, were English workers who basically protested machines because they were taking their jobs. So they protested the same grid that we now today just accept as matter of fact. So they were opposed to industrialization or any new technology. So they were very traditionalist, they were very conservative when it comes to the specialization of society. Now, we can see how this would be very limiting from the perspective of advancing science. A part of me is torn because I am a very scientifically minded person. I fully support the higher level cognitive pursuits of man in order to understand the universe with which we are a part. At the same time, I recognize that we make ourselves very vulnerable when we do that. And indeed, I don't believe that our ethics and our morality are evolving in tandem with our amazing technological innovations. So this is why a person like myself, who I'm not out there saying that the world is going to end right away. I don't buy into the crazy conspiracy theory stuff that everybody's gawking at. I'm not just looking at it for an excuse to prep. I'm not a person who is a doomsday fanatic who believes that doomsday is going to come on a certain date and that you should prepare for it to happen on a certain date. You'll never see me promoting that mentality here on this channel. The reason why I prep is rooted in an objective critical analysis of this environment that we find ourselves in today. So one of the central tasks then of somebody who is genuinely interested in preparing for some impending societal collapse, which I'm not saying is necessarily going to happen, I'm saying that it could happen, and then if it did, the longer and longer we go along this trajectory of technological advancement, the worse it's going to be if the crap were to hit the fan. So getting a familiarity with occupations within the primary, secondary, and tertiary sectors, and in some cases, in terms of communications, basic communications, the quaternary sector, having a good understanding of those things is what's going to equate to sustainability post-collapse. Myself, I currently have a job in the human services, and based on this research which was done, my job in the human services is actually very secure because it's one of the few jobs which robots are not going to be capable of doing for a long time. Now, you could actually argue against this too, because a lot of psychologists and mental health professionals are going to be sidelined the more and more people start resorting to pharmaceuticals to deal with their mental health issues. But by and large, it's going to be a long time before a robot is able to do the job of a psychologist. Nonetheless, while that might put me in an advantageous position now, it puts me in a very disadvantageous position should a collapse ever come. So essentially, you have to pick one. You're damned if you do, or you're damned if you don't. Now, you can try to have some in between. I've contemplated learning a trade, having something in one of those first three sectors, some specialization in those first three sectors to complement my specialization in the human services. Now, obviously, this takes a lot of time and resources, and it's very hard for a person to master two things. So you're spreading your time and your energy out into two different pursuits. So you're only going to be mediocre in those two things. So you have to ask yourself then, where do you fit into this occupational matrix? And you can go to this website and you can enter your occupation and you can see the likelihood whether or not your job will be automated. But you need to understand one of the major fallacies a lot of futurists make is that they base their predictions of how things will be. It's that they base their projections on how things will be in the future by maximizing the technology of today and not envisioning different revolutionary innovations which may come out. For instance, people could imagine smartphones 30 years ago, but they couldn't really imagine all of the various software and applications that are now commonplace with smartphones. So what I'm trying to say is it's probably going to be a lot worse than is projected here. And so what you have then, to sum all this up, is you have increased environmental degradation. You have this whole tiny house movement where they're trying to move people into smaller and smaller matchboxes, stuff them into these big, large urban centers, This is why you have the CEOs of these major companies like Mark Zuckerberg talking about giving people a living wage, because they recognize that because of automation, a lot of these jobs are not going to be sustainable. This is why you have the increase in food stamps. Lots of people look to the outsourcing of jobs. Yes, that's one thing, but being lost within that is the immense amount of automation which is happening right before our eyes, and it's not being replaced fast enough with human and information service jobs, because quite frankly, not everybody is qualified nor educated enough to do those things. And so we have all of these major issues coming into a head at once, and conveniently we have declining birth rates at the same time, which perhaps is a blessing in disguise. We have the increasingly dehumanized, in some respects, homogeneity of culture, and the whole transhumanist movement, which I'm not saying these things are necessarily even good nor bad, because whether they are good or bad is a matter of perspective, really. I'm just saying that they put us at risk of not being ready to weather the storm of a collapse situation, and every year that goes by, as we become more and more hardwired to the grid, as we become more and more dependent on the big incubator that keeps us all alive in the big urban hives, the more naked and afraid we are going to be if the crap hits the fan. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comments. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Canadian Prepper out.